What if everything we believe we know about someone is nothing more than a distorted reflection cast against the wall of our own expectations? What if love, this feeling we think is capable of revealing the best in us, were also the curtain that hides what we refuse to see? Names carry stories, and stories carry wounds. And some wounds, when touched, awaken echoes we would rather keep asleep. But what happens when the echo grows louder than the silence? And what if, instead of answers, we find more questions each time we try to understand who is really at our side? What if death weren't the end, but the beginning of a whisper that insists on crossing time itself? What if a promise made years ago, forgotten or ignored, returned, like a shadow moving on its own through the corridors of memory? And what if we discovered that the person we love carries a secret so deep that even the name he uses doesn't truly belong to him? Some memories gather in layers, like dust on old furniture inside an abandoned mansion. And some destinies cross like birds trapped in the same wind, unable to choose another direction. Love can illuminate, but it can also blind. It can heal, but it can also open the door to a darkness we never imagined facing. And what if that door were about to open right now, in front of us? The story that follows does not begin with certainties, but with omens. It is not born from comfort, but from unease. It emerges from a glance held too long, a gesture too gentle, a silence too prolonged, those things we ignore at first because we believe love protects us from all dangers. But love doesn't protect. Love only reveals, and it's up to us to decide whether we want to see the mansion where everything unfolds is more than a setting. It is a witness. Its walls, old and marked by time, guard stories that belong to none of us, yet insist on revealing themselves to those who dare to cross its threshold. Some houses breathe, some houses listen, some houses watch. And this mansion seemed to do all of that at once, as if it were waiting for someone, as if it longed for its secrets to finally be exposed. And what if, upon entering its corridors, each step echoed like a warning? What if the cold that brushed the skin didn't come from the temperature, but from something we cannot name? Perhaps that is how everything begins, with the feeling that we are crossing not just a place, but a forbidden boundary, a silent invitation that should have been refused. The protagonist's life, the one who narrates without knowing she is also narrating herself, begins to change the moment she steps onto that land heavy with memories. It wasn't just the wind blowing through the ancient trees. It wasn't just the smell of damp wood saturating the air. There was something deeper, as if the very atmosphere carried fragments of stories waiting to be touched. The man she loved stood before her with his gentle smile, his low voice, his air of someone who carries the world on his shoulders. But there was something in him, something too small to notice, yet too big to ignore. A hesitation in his gaze, a breath taken just a moment too late. A name, he said naturally, yet one that seemed to slip off his identity like clothing that didn't quite fit. What if that name wasn't real? And what if the love she felt for him was unknowingly tied to a lie carefully sewn over the years? What if every memory they built together was about to shatter with a single revelation? These questions echoed within her, even if she couldn't yet form them into words. It was as if her intuition were knocking on a locked door inside her, asking to come in. But who has the courage to open certain doors? Destiny, however, has its own ways. It doesn't wait. It doesn't ask for permission. It simply happens. And at that moment, the one that becomes the true beginning of this story, the protagonist sensed her life was about to split into before and after. The mansion door creaked as it opened, as if protesting being disturbed after so many years. The wind blew inside, stirring dust and old secrets into the air. She took a deep breath, her heartbeat turned irregular, almost restless, as if warning her. There, on that threshold, she knew without knowing why that she was entering a place where love and fear intertwine, where memory and promise weave together, where every shadow might carry a forgotten truth. And so the story begins. She crossed the threshold of the mansion, and everything she thought she knew about the man she loved began to crumble in silence. She slowly sat down on the bed, trying to pinpoint the source. The man beside her remained motionless, like a sleeping statue. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, as if it were waiting for something. The protagonist walked to the bedroom door on silent steps. She pressed her ear against the old wood. Nothing. No sound except her own quickened breathing. But then, she felt it. A cold draft slipped in under the door, as if something had just passed along the corridor. She went back to the bed, but she didn't sleep. She stayed there, awake, until the dark sky quietly turned into a pale gray. The man finally moved, as if only then he had been allowed to wake up. He asked if she had slept well, but his voice sounded automatic, almost mechanical. She answered with just a slight nod, studying every detail of his face, every micro-expression, because now she knew, with absolute certainty, that the name he had given her was not his real name, and the mansion seemed to know it too. When the sun began to filter through the window, bringing the pale light of morning, the protagonist understood something that made her shiver. That house was not just the backdrop to the secret, it was part of it. The shadows, the portraits, the silent corridors, everything there seemed to conspire to reveal a truth the man beside her was doing everything he could to hide. And it was in that moment, on the threshold of a new day, that the protagonist realized whatever was wrong did not come from the mansion, it came from him, and the house was only reflecting it. Morning brought a pale, almost timid light that barely managed to cut through the fog wrapped around the mansion. The day seemed to be born tired, as if it carried the weight of everything that had happened the night before, everything though officially, nothing had happened. The protagonist felt that weight in her chest, as if she had aged overnight, as if her own body bore invisible marks of a silent battle. The man she loved was already up, dressed, put together, far too put together for someone who should have been waking from a deep sleep. There were no signs of fatigue, no distant stare, no confused expression, only control, a calmness that by then no longer seemed natural, but rehearsed. He said he needed to check something in the house basement, a detail about the electrical system that might explain the power fluctuations from the previous night. But the protagonist caught a strange glint in his expression, as if that excuse were older than the situation itself, as if it were a line he had used many times, in many different circumstances. She watched as he walked down the hallway, descending the stairs with steps so light they were almost too quiet for someone of his height and build. As soon as he disappeared to the lower floor, the mansion seemed to sigh. The protagonist was left alone with the distant echo of his footsteps, until those two faded away, and then came the silence, a silence that settled like lead. She decided she needed to understand what was bothering her. She could no longer ignore the signs. There was something deep and pulsing begging to be discovered. The fear she felt wasn't enough to stop her. In fact, it was that very fear that pushed her forward. She started by exploring the upstairs hallway. She ran her fingers along the frames of the old paintings, feeling the cold, rough wood, as if each detail held an untold story. In the portraits, the faces seemed to follow her movements, watching her with eyes that no longer belonged to anyone alive. Every expression was a silent reminder that there was much more to that house than he had admitted. She entered a smaller room at the end of the corridor. It was an old study, with shelves full of books so ancient that the air itself seemed thicker in there. The smell of aged paper filled the space. The light coming through the small window created golden particles that danced in the air like dust suspended in time. On the desk, there were scattered papers, apparently abandoned many years ago, but that wasn't what caught her attention. It was the book in the center of the desk, a large volume with a dark leather cover and no title on the spine. The protagonist felt an inexplicable urge and opened it. The first detail that made her shudder was the handwriting. The script was careful, firm, but eerily familiar. She didn't know exactly why, but something in that handwriting stirred a restless recognition, as if she had seen that same writing somewhere else, in a completely different context. The pages were filled with records, dates, old names, men and women from a bloodline that seemed to stretch back for centuries, but each name was followed by small notes, brief comments, some trivial, others dark. One particular entry caught her eye. He arrived today. He is not the true heir, but he will be treated as such until the matter is resolved. The promise must continue, even if the name doesn't match the story. The protagonist felt a chill run down her spine. That sentence seemed to speak directly to the suspicion growing inside her since the first night in the mansion. She turned more pages. Other notes appeared. The name does not suit him. He pretends to be who he is not, but there is no alternative. The legacy must remain alive, even through someone who is not the one it should be. The words drove themselves into her chest like needles. And then, on one of the final pages, the entry that made her hands tremble. Today we decided to give him a new name, the name he must use from now on, the name that will protect the house, the name that hides the true heir, the one who never returned. And there, written with perfect clarity, was the name of the man she loved, the name by which she knew him. The name she now knew was not his. The protagonist snapped the book shut, as if simply looking at those words were enough to draw something into the room. Her fingers were cold, and her heart was beating unevenly, as if it were trying to break through her ribs. She left the study, taking deep breaths to regain control, but the mansion did not allow peace. The hallway seemed narrower, darker, as if the house were alert to her movements, as if it sensed that the truth was beginning to be touched. She heard a distant sound coming from the basement, a metallic, dragging noise that echoed through the walls. Her instincts told her not to go down there, but instinct was no longer stronger than the need to know. She walked to the main staircase, which now seemed longer than before. Each step creaked in protest, as if warning her to go back. The protagonist ignored it. She descended slowly, trying to brace herself for what she might find. The morning light illuminated only part of the hall. The rest of the house remained wrapped in shadow. When she reached the corridor leading to the basement, she felt a subtle change in the air. It was colder, damper. The smell of earth and metal dominated everything. The basement door was slightly ajar, a thin beam of weak light escaping from underneath. She took the first step into the darkness, and then she heard his voice. But it wasn't the voice she knew, soft, controlled, steady. It was much lower, almost a murmur, as if he was speaking to someone who shouldn't be there. The tone was different, deeper, almost threatening. The protagonist froze on the stairs. She couldn't understand the words, but she knew this wasn't casual conversation. It was as if he were repeating something, reciting, obeying something greater than himself, or someone. The house suddenly seemed to hold its breath. Every speck of dust suspended in the air seemed to listen along with her. And then, at last, he stopped speaking. An absolute silence filled the space, heavy as stone. The protagonist knew, in that instant, that he was not alone down there, and that the name he carried was not the only thing he was hiding. The wood creaked beneath her feet, but she tried to control the sound, as if any noise could alert him. Then she heard it. A second sound. It wasn't his voice. It was something smaller. Something like the rustle of fabric or the scrape of a chair. A subtle movement, but clearly belonging to another presence. The protagonist held her breath. Fear began to take shape. This was no longer just about secrets, but about someone. There was someone down there with him, and the whole mansion seemed to know it. She took another step until her foot reached the last stair before the cold stone floor. The door was only pushed to, not fully closed. As she approached, the protagonist noticed that the wood was even older than the rest of the house, a heavy door, scarred with scratches, as if it had been forced many times. She placed her hand on the door, feeling the rough texture of the wood. The touch was cold, unpleasant, almost repulsive. Fear trembled inside her like a small animal, but a determined one. Even so, she drew a deep breath and pushed the door open just enough to see inside. The basement was not just a storage area. It was a meticulously arranged room, with candles lit in old holders, bathing the space in an orange glow that made everything look even stranger. And along the walls, rows of boxes, trunks, and shelves packed with documents. The shadow over the face made it impossible to distinguish any features, but there was something there, something that seemed to look without eyes. The protagonist felt her body turn to ice. The man didn't speak. He simply stood there, facing the figure as if awaiting instructions, as if he was standing before someone to whom he owed obedience, or fear. The protagonist instinctively took a step back, but the wood creaking under her weight shattered the silence like thunder. The sound echoed along the corridor, cut through the stone walls, and bounced around the basement. The man turned immediately, His gaze locked with hers, with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. There was no genuine surprise in his eyes, there was something else. Then he drew a deep breath and said the basement was full of family things, old stories, delicate documents, nothing appropriate for her to be snooping through. The explanation dropped into the air like a poorly stitched lie. She felt immediately that those words were part of a narrative built long ago, a narrative repeated until it became almost automatic. The protagonist, however, had already seen too much. She had heard the strange voice, she had seen the figure in the chair, she had witnessed the panic jumping across his face. And inside her, one thought finally took shape. He wasn't protecting her, he was containing her. When he grabbed her arm with too much firmness for someone supposedly so calm, she understood how serious things really were. It wasn't a violent gesture, but it was controlling, pure control, a gesture that said more than any explanation. "Don't go where I can't follow you." He asked her to go back to the bedroom. He asked in a low voice, almost gentle, but loaded with an underlying tension that the mansion only amplified. It was as if even the walls were listening to that plea. She climbed the stairs with her body trembling, feeling his gaze burning into her back. When she reached the upper floor, the corridor seemed darker, more humid. The mansion seemed to react to what she had seen, as if every shadow were alive with the information she now carried. Back in the bedroom, she sat on the edge of the bed, trying to control her breathing. The mirror returned her pale reflection, and for the first time since arriving, she saw something in her own eyes she didn't know how to name, a mixture of terror and clarity. There was no room left for doubt. There was someone else in the house, and that someone knew the truth about his name. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was the growing, almost tangible sense that the entire mansion wanted her to find out, and that now it was too late to turn back. The protagonist stayed seated on the edge of the bed for long minutes, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The mansion's silence didn't help. It was a thick, almost physical silence that seemed to fill the room in a suffocating way. She felt the weight of the air in her lungs, as if breathing in that house required more effort than usual. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing second. The mirror in front of her seemed to come alive. It didn't move, of course, but the way it reflected the light, the way it returned her image, the way it highlighted every detail in the room, everything felt charged with its own intention. It was as if someone or something on the other side of the glass were watching her with patience and expectation. She looked away. She didn't want to face her own uneasiness reflected back at her. She stood and began to walk slowly around the room, carefully. She needed to keep moving, needed to shake off the numbness threatening to overtake her. Her hands slid over the furniture, feeling the textures as if touch alone might reveal some hidden truth. The cold wood of the dresser, the rough fabric of the curtains, the icy metal of the doorknob. Everything there seemed to hold small clues about what was happening, but the mansion offered no answers, only more questions. As she approached the window, she saw the fog outside wrap the landscape like a thick cloak. The trees looked like dark, twisted shadows, and the pale daylight barely managed to pierce that opaque layer. The sense of isolation was almost suffocating. If something happened there, no one would see, no one would hear. The mansion was its own world. That was when she heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow footsteps, heavy, with an uneven rhythm, as if someone dragged one foot behind. Her body tensed. The footsteps weren't his. She knew his walk always light, precise, almost soundless. These steps were the opposite, clumsy, soaked in time, weighed down by something old. The footsteps came closer, and stopped right in front of the bedroom door. The protagonist held her breath. Her heart beat so loud it seemed to fill the silence with dry, sharp thumps. For a moment she was sure the door would open, that whatever was outside would walk in, that she would finally see the face of the presence moving through the mansion like a conscious shadow. But nothing happened. No knock, no creak, nothing but that deep pause in the silence. And then, the footsteps moved on. Slowly, dragging down the corridor until they faded in the distance. The protagonist felt her legs tremble. It was becoming more and more clear that there was something in the house that did not belong to ordinary life. Something that moved between rooms, that watched, that waited. Something that might be connected to the figure she had seen in the basement, or perhaps it was something else, something even older. She knew she needed to confront him, needed to demand answers, needed to understand what was going on. But when she went downstairs to look for him, she found the main hall completely empty. The mansion seemed bigger in his absence. The echo of her own footsteps reverberated in an unsettling way, as if the space itself were reacting to her presence. She called for him, but her voice dissolved into the walls. No answer, no sign of where he might be. That was when she noticed something odd. The door leading to the side garden, an old door of dark wood, was slightly open. That was strange, because when they had arrived at the mansion, he'd mentioned that side of the property was condemned, unsafe to walk through, overrun with vegetation and unstable structures. He had specifically told her not to go there, but the door was open, a silent invitation, or a warning. The protagonist hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door and stepping outside. The cold, damp air wrapped around her skin like an unpleasant embrace. The tall grass brushed against her ankles, and the smell of soaked earth filled the air. The side garden looked even more abandoned than the front of the house. There were broken stones, fallen branches, an old fountain completely covered in moss. In the back, almost hidden by the fog, there was a glass greenhouse. Or rather, what remained of it. Many panes were shattered, others were opaque from years of accumulated grime. The protagonist felt a restless pull, as if the greenhouse were calling her, a cold, almost melancholy summons. When she got closer, she realized the glass was fogged from the inside, as if there were moisture, as if there were breaths. She placed her hand on the icy surface, and the sensation was immediate. The glass was far too cold. Cold like metal buried in ice. Old, dried plants spilled from cracked pots. The smell of dead leaves mingled with something else. Something sweet, almost nauseating. In the center of the greenhouse, there was a wooden table with dark stains, as if liquids had trickled there many times. Next to the table, a chair lay tipped onto its side, as if someone had knocked it over in haste. But what truly made her shudder was the object on the floor, a photograph, yellowed, worn, without frame or protection. She crouched slowly, heart racing, and picked the photograph up carefully. It was an old image, possibly decades old. It showed a man standing beside the same mansion, but his expression was rigid, severe, weighed down by deep melancholy. The most disturbing part, however, wasn't the face. The same name the book and the study said wasn't real. But there was something even more unsettling. The date written beneath the name, a distant date. Far too old. From a time before he was even born. The protagonist felt her whole body go cold. When she lifted her gaze to the greenhouse door, the world seemed to shrink for a moment. He was there. No anger. No shock. No sadness. Just awareness. As if he knew exactly what she had just found. As if he had been waiting for this moment. And the mansion, silent as always, seemed to hold its breath around them. He remained at the greenhouse entrance, as if he were part of the structure, as still, quiet, solid figure that the fog curled around without ever quite touching. His body straight, hands at his sides, shoulders rigid. It was as if he had been carved into place, in that exact instant, to witness what she had discovered. The protagonist still held the photograph. She felt the rough edges against her fingers, as if the paper itself were infused with something alive. Something capable of pulsing. The air inside the greenhouse grew denser, almost viscous, as if the room were shrinking around them. She didn't try to hide the photo. There was no point in pretending anymore. He knew she had found it. In fact, from the way he looked at her, it seemed he had been expecting this for a long time. He took a step inside. The creak of the old wood under his feet echoed strangely, a long, low sound that bounced off the glass walls. It was his first movement since appearing at the door, and it was enough to make her instinctively back away 2 steps. His expression showed no hostility. It showed nothing. It was as if he had switched off every human emotion, leaving only that fixed stare, a heavy, deep, almost weary gaze. She tried to speak. She wanted to ask who the man in the photograph was. She wanted to demand answers about the date, about the repeated name, about the eerie familiarity of that portrait. But when she opened her mouth, no voice came. It was as if the mansion had stolen the sound from her throat. He stepped closer, silent. With each step, he seemed to absorb part of the weak light seeping into the greenhouse, growing darker, as if he carried shadows with him. Finally, he extended his hand, not to take hers, not to touch her, but to ask for the photograph. The gesture was slow, almost solemn. She hesitated. Her entire body protested at the idea of handing it over. But something deeper inside her, quiet, insistent, intuition told her that resisting in that moment could change everything, for the worse. So she gave it to him. His fingers closed around the photograph with unexpected delicacy, as if he were holding something sacred, or forbidden. He stared at it for a few seconds in silence. He seemed to read something invisible in the image, something she could not grasp. And then, with an almost imperceptible movement, he slipped the photo into his coat pocket, as if he needed to protect it. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, lower, deeper, laden with something impossible to define. He said she shouldn't have come to the greenhouse. It wasn't a threat, it was a statement, a regret. She managed to respond. At last the words came, and she asked what that date on the photograph meant. She asked why his name appeared there, decades before his birth. She asked who the man in the picture was. He closed his eyes as if feeling a crushing weight, as if each question were a stone thrown onto an already overburdened body. When he opened his eyes again, there was a shadow in them she had never seen before, silent darkness. He didn't answer, he simply turned and walked out of the greenhouse, as if being there had become impossible, as if facing those questions meant breaking something he had been holding together for a very long time. The protagonist ran after him. The cold wind whipped her face, and the thick fog blurred her view, but she didn't stop. The side garden looked stranger than before, with stretched shadows that didn't match the sun's position. The trees seemed to lean inward, following her steps. She reached him at the beginning of the corridor leading back into the mansion. She grabbed his arm tightly, trying to stop him from slipping away again. He stopped, but didn't look at her right away. He seemed to be fighting something inside himself. When he finally turned, his expression was no longer neutral. It was sad, deeply sad. A sadness that didn't come from anything she'd said or done. It was older than them, broader than any human relationship. A sadness that seemed tied to the very ground of the house, to its walls, its shadows. He said she was awakening something that should have remained asleep. He said there were things in the house that didn't belong to this time, things that reacted to her presence, things that were waiting. He said the mansion had memory, its own memory, independent, almost conscious, and that the name he carried was part of that memory. But before she could ask what that meant, a sound echoed through the corridor. It didn't come from the garden. It didn't come from the upper floor. It didn't come from the basement. It was as if it came from every direction at once. A whisper, low, dragging, unintelligible, but even without understanding the words, she felt the meaning, a calling. He turned pale. The mansion seemed to vibrate in response to the whisper, as if it were a living organism reacting to a stimulus. The walls creaked, the floor trembled very slightly. The candles in the main hall flickered, even from afar. It was as if something had realized that the truth was close. The whisper returned, this time louder, almost a long drawn-out moan. The air turned cold. He gripped her wrist tightly, said she needed to stay away from the basement. It was no longer a request. It was desperation. But in that exact moment, the protagonist felt something entirely different, a strange, deep, almost inevitable sensation, as if the basement were calling to her. As if something alive behind that old door had awakened precisely because she had come too close to the truth. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't recklessness. It was an inexplicable pull, as if she were connected to whatever was there in a way she couldn't explain. And the mansion seemed to agree. The old ceiling light flickered, as if something had just passed quickly through the house. He noticed, and for the first time since they arrived, she saw real fear in his eyes. Not fear of the mansion, not fear of the figure in the basement. Fear of her, fear of what she represented, fear of what her presence meant for the story he'd been trying to keep buried. He stepped back, releasing her wrist. And in that gesture, the protagonist understood something terrible. He didn't just have a borrowed name, he had a borrowed life, and the mansion was beginning to demand back what belonged to it. The silence that followed his retreat was almost unbearable. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next move, deciding what to reveal and what to hide. The protagonist remained there in the hallway, feeling the echo of his grip still pulsing in her wrist. It was strange. His hold had been firm, desperate, but not painful, only urgent, like he had tried to warn her, not restrain her. The mansion seemed to be watching. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts, but there was no stability left. Every new discovery, every gesture of his, every whisper from the walls, everything was building an impossible puzzle, and for every piece that fit, 5 others fell out of place. And at the center of it all was his name. A name that wasn't his. A name that didn't belong to anyone alive. A name that seemed to circle through the mansion like an entity of its own. The protagonist began walking down the hallway, guided by something she couldn't name. She wasn't looking for him anymore, not in that moment. She needed to look for answers. She needed to let the house lead her. There was something in the air, something nearly intangible, that seemed to invite her to go on. She passed the grand staircase again. Pale morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the floor. But now, the once vibrant tones of the old glass looked faded, as if the mansion were draining the colors and leaving only shadows behind. When she reached the main hall, the protagonist noticed the room felt different. The heavy curtains fluttered slightly, though there was no wind strong enough to move them. The crystal chandelier sent small flashes of light skittering across the ceiling, creating the illusion of fast-moving shapes, almost like little figures darting around. And in the center of the hall, on the table that had previously been empty, lay an object that shouldn't be there. A notebook, dark cover, closed, and mysteriously clean, as if it didn't belong to the house at all. She approached. The notebook seemed to call to her, as if it had been left there especially for her. There was something disturbing about how it stood out from the rest of the room, not just because it was out of place, but because it felt alive, pulsing, as though it carried a hidden message. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the cover. The texture was smooth, almost warm to the touch, as if someone had handled it recently. When she opened the notebook, the first page was covered in familiar handwriting, the same handwriting from the book in the study. That careful, elegant, somber script that seemed to carry the weight of decades. And at the top of the page, a title that made her heart race, record of the name bearer. She felt the air leave her lungs for a moment. She read it again, slowly, bearer, as if the name were an object, as if the name were a duty, or a curse. The pages that followed were filled with long, dense paragraphs written in an almost ritualistic tone. She began to read, even with her chest tight, even knowing she might not be ready for what she was about to find. The text described an ancient tradition, something far beyond the family history he had mentioned. It spoke of a spiritual lineage, a kind of inheritance that was not biological, but symbolic. An inheritance tied to the mansion, to its shadows, to the house's memory. The bearer of the name was responsible for keeping a promise made generations ago. A promise whose origin wasn't clear in the text, only that it involved a disappearance, deep mourning, and the need to keep a presence alive within the mansion to prevent something from breaking. And then came the sentence that made the protagonist's stomach twist. When the true heir was lost, we chose one who would carry his name, so that the house would not fall completely asleep. She read on. The name must not die, the figure must remain. The presence must be maintained, even if it is not the same person. The protagonist stepped back, feeling her legs threaten to give out. The notebook slipped from her hands and hit the table with a dry thud. The sound echoed through the hall, as if the mansion itself were responding. This wasn't a simple change of name. It wasn't an ordinary lie. It was a role, a function, a place inside the house. The man she loved wasn't just someone who had assumed another identity. He was part of a ritual, a continuity, a replacement, and somehow, the mansion required that figure. Before she could fully process what she had read, a sound cut through her thoughts, a soft dragging, slow, heavy. It came from one of the dark corridors leading to the unrestored wings of the mansion. The protagonist turned immediately, her heartbeat quickening. The sound continued, getting closer, as if something were being pulled across the floor, and then it stopped. The house fell into absolute silence. She took a deep breath and slowly backed away, without taking her eyes off the corridor entrance. The darkness inside seemed thicker there, almost tangible. Something in that shadow was watching her. It wasn't a feeling, it was certainty. Suddenly, something moved. Not a full shape, not a body, just a flicker, a tear in the air, a fold of light twisting as if trying to take form. The protagonist felt an inexplicable force pulling her attention into that corridor, as if something wanted her to come closer. It was the same feeling she'd had with the basement, the same silent, dense, irresistible pull, But this time, something inside her fought back, a visceral, primitive instinct that told her stepping into that corridor would be an irreversible mistake. She stepped back a little more, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. The notebook was still there, open on the page of the record. The handwriting seemed to shift under the light, as if the words were alive, breathing. The sound returned, now louder, more violent. The dragging became pounding, dull, heavy blows, as if something large were slamming against the walls. And then, a voice, not a whisper, not a moan, a voice, filled with anger, or pain, or despair. The protagonist couldn't understand the words, but she recognized something in the tone and echo of the voice she'd heard in the basement, the figure in the chair, that faceless presence. The entire house seemed to react to that voice, shuddering slightly, creaking, as if repressed memories were waking up. Then she heard footsteps behind her. Light footsteps, human, familiar. She turned quickly. He was there, the man she loved, but something in his face had changed. He looked drained of color, as if he had aged years in just a few minutes. His expression held a deep exhaustion, but also resignation. He looked at the notebook on the table, then he looked at her, and something broke in his gaze. He said the house needed her now, that the house had chosen her, that the name was getting closer, and that he wouldn't be able to hold it back much longer. The protagonist felt fear take on a solid form in her chest, because in that instant, she understood this wasn't just about finding out who he was. It was about finding out what was trying to take his place. His words hung in the air, heavy, almost solid. The house had chosen her. It wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't an exaggeration. It was a truth spoken with the desperate sincerity of someone who had already crossed the limit of what they could endure. The protagonist couldn't move a muscle. Her body felt seized by sudden paralysis, not caused by him, but by the realization of what it all meant. The house choosing her for what? To replace him, to fulfill the promise that spanned generations, or for something even darker, something he didn't dare put into words. He took a step toward her. His face was lined with an almost unnatural exhaustion, as if he had been fighting something invisible for far too long. His once controlled, guarded gaze now bore deep cracks. It was like looking at someone seconds away from collapsing. The protagonist stepped back, not out of fear of him, but out of fear of what she was about to hear. He understood, and let his arms drop to his sides, in a gesture that looked more like surrender than threat. He said he couldn't stop what was happening, said he had tried for years, tried to keep the name alive, to fulfill the role, to uphold the promise, tried to protect the house, protect the memory, protect something he never fully explained. And above all, he had tried to protect her. The mansion's walls began to let out small cracking sounds, as if the wood were expanding or contracting violently. The light through the windows wavered, distorted. A cold current swept across the hall with such force that it made the chandeliers sway, filling the air with a sharp, crystalline sound. The mansion was reacting. He moved closer again, now with steadier steps. It wasn't aggression, it was urgency. He said the house had recognized her the moment she crossed the threshold, that there was something about her, something he couldn't explain, that drew the place's attention. It wasn't just the house's curiosity, it was attraction, deep, ancient, inevitable. The protagonist tried to deny it, tried to say it made no sense, tried to insist that nothing in that house had anything to do with her, but that would have been a lie. From the very first night, she had felt something pulling her, wrapping around her, watching her. From the first time she had looked into the bedroom mirror, she had felt seen by something else. From the first whisper in the hallway, she had felt called. She wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. He went on, now in a lower voice, as if he were afraid the walls could hear him, as if they were capable of reacting to any unwanted admission. He told her he wasn't the first to carry that name, that before him there had been others, and before them, more still, all chosen not by blood, but by necessity. The name needed to be occupied, the name needed to exist, the name needed to remain inside the house, to prevent the true heir from returning. A deep shiver ran down the protagonist's spine. It was as if something inside her reacted to that sentence. The true heir, the one who was lost, the one whose name had been taken by someone else, the one whose absence the house tried to fill through substitutes. He explained that when he was young, he'd been brought to the mansion by distant relatives. He hadn't understood anything at the time. Only later did he learn he had been chosen not by the family, but by the house, that the mansion had accepted him, that the house had shaped him, that he stopped being who he was to become who he needed to be. And even then, he was never fully accepted. There was always something missing, something his presence could never complete, something that her presence now seemed to supply. The protagonist felt the air grow thin, as if something were sucking the atmosphere out around her. The mansion felt more alive than ever alive, hungry, insistent. The sound from the dark corridor returned clearer this time, more defined. It wasn't just dragging anymore, it was walking. A slow, heavy, deliberate walk, as if someone or something were approaching. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. He was growing far too pale. He said there was a reason she had seen the figure in the basement, that no one before her had ever been able to see it so clearly. Not him, not the ones who came before him. She was the first to see, the first to hear, the first to hear, the first who could sense the presence of the true heir, the true owner of the name. The protagonist took another step back. She couldn't breathe properly. Her mind swarmed with questions, but none could take shape. Her heart was beating so fast it felt ready to burst. And then he said something that cut through the air like a blade. He's coming back. It wasn't hope. It wasn't fear. It was a statement. He, the heir, the original name, the presence that lived in the basement, was trying to return to the place he should never have left. And that return seemed to be directly tied to her presence. The protagonist felt the mansion shudder literally. A faint tremor ran across the floor, making dust quiver on the furniture. The crystal chandelier swung harder, emitting a sharp sound. The windows rattled. The light flickered. He leaned forward slightly, as if he were about to fall. The house was draining something from him. Strength, vitality, presence. It was as if he were losing his connection to the name, to the role, to the identity he had carried for so long. He raised a trembling hand and touched her face. It was a gentle touch, a farewell touch. He said he never had a choice, that he had lived to keep the name alive, that he had sacrificed everything, even his own identity, to hold the air away from the surface of the house. But she was different. The house wanted something from her that he did not have, something he could never offer, something she didn't understand, but that the mansion recognized instantly. And then, with a weaker voice than ever, he spoke the sentence that shattered everything inside her. The name doesn't want me anymore. It wants you. The protagonist felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. Literally, a crash echoed through the house. The walls shook. The curtains ballooned as if a furious wind had torn through the hall. And for the first time, she clearly heard the voice from the basement. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't a moan. It was a call, calling for her, by her name, not as if it were learning it, but as if it had always known it, as if it had carried it long before she did. The man who loved her staggered and fell to his knees. The mansion seemed to drain him, devour him slowly, making him more fragile with every passing second. And the protagonist realized there were only two choices now: run or answer the call. But the house was far too alive, far too alert, far too closed. And deep down, she knew there was no way out. The hallway seemed to narrow around her, as if the mansion were changing shape in response to the call echoing from its depths. The protagonist felt her chest tighten, as if invisible hands were pressing the air out of her lungs. The atmosphere had grown so heavy that it was hard to tell what was fear and what was the house itself pressing against her skin. The voice, that deep, ancient voice, laden with centuries, repeated her name. Not the name she'd been called since childhood, but a name she had never spoken. A name that sounded foreign, ancient, almost ritualistic. And yet, something inside her reacted. Something woke up. It was as if the voice had found a crack inside her, a dormant space that finally opened. The sensation was so intense she had to brace her hand against the wall to keep from collapsing. The wood was cold, so cold it burned. The surface seemed to pulse beneath her palm, as if the house had veins, as if blood ran beneath the old paneling. Behind her, the man she loved or thought she loved was still on his knees, struggling to keep his eyes open. His body seemed to lose definition, as if something invisible were draining not just his strength, but his existence. He tried to call out to her, but his voice came out weak, fragmented, almost unrecognizable. He said she could still resist, that she could still fight the call, that nothing was decided yet. But she knew in that moment that it wasn't true. The house had already chosen. The mansion, that immense structure of wood, stone, and memory, seemed to vibrate in unison with the voice rising from the basement. The ceiling cracked. The floor trembled. The windows let out a piercing sound, as if they were about to shatter, and from the dark corridor to the left, a shadow stretched slowly along the floor, a long, shapeless form that slid like heavy smoke. The shadow moved without any hurry. It didn't need to. It already knew she wouldn't run. The shadow stopped in front of her, just inches from her feet, and with almost reverent slowness, it rose like a column of dense fog. It was tall, but without any defined human shape. A fluid, silent outline that seemed to waver between existing and vanishing. And then eyes formed. Not full eyes, not physical ones. but two darker patches that seemed to watch her, to recognize her with the certainty of someone who has finally found what they'd been searching for. The protagonist felt her heart pounding so fast it seemed ready to rip free of her chest. Her legs shook, her breathing had become a thin, desperate thread, and still she didn't step back. She couldn't. The shadow leaned forward slightly, as if it were smelling her presence, recognizing her scent, confirming her identity. The sensation was so invasive she closed her eyes for a moment, trying to regain control, and failed. When she opened her eyes again, the shadow was gone, but the air was different now. Far too silent, far too charged. The voice, louder now, sounded again. This time, it didn't just echo through the walls. It echoed inside her, calling, summoning, claiming. The man on the floor tried to get up, but couldn't. His body gave out, collapsing again. The mansion seemed to press him down, forcing him toward the ground, pushing him away, rejecting him. He clenched his fist, as if fighting against a force that wanted to tear him out of himself. And then she understood. The house wasn't just draining his strength, the house was draining his name. The name he had carried for so many years, the name he had protected. The name that now was crumbling like dust in the hands of time. He lifted his gaze, a look full of pain, guilt, and resignation. He said, with a voice weaker than before, that he never should have let her in. Because the moment she crossed that door, something inside the mansion recognized her, and the bond was formed. The protagonist felt that bond, an invisible thread tugging at her chest, pulling her toward the basement, a force that couldn't be explained by logic, fear, or desire. It was something that existed beyond human understanding. The mansion, like a living organism, was moving toward a single purpose, to bring back what belonged to it, and somehow, she was the missing piece needed to complete the ritual. A dry crack sounded in the distance, then another, and another, as if old doors were being opened one by one, as if something were rising from the lowest levels of the house, traveling through hidden corridors, drawing closer. She felt it. She didn't see it, but she felt it. Movement, approach, intention. The man on the floor stretched his hand toward her, begging not with words, but with his eyes for her to resist, to fight, not to let the name enter her. But the call was irresistible. The protagonist heard her own breathing again, but this time there was another sound layered beneath it. A subtle sound, a rhythm like a heartbeat, not hers. Heartbeats coming from the walls, from the beams, from the floor. The mansion had a heart, and it was racing. She took a step without realizing it. A step toward the basement. His eyes widened. He tried to get up, but the house pushed him down with an invisible force, as if saying, "It's not your turn anymore." The protagonist felt tears spring to her eyes, not just from fear, but from a deep sadness, a sense of loss, as if she were about to cross a boundary from which she could never return. With a trembling, almost inaudible voice, she asked what would happen if she answered the call. He drew a ragged breath, struggling to form each word. "And he will take what has always been his." "And what is?" she asked, even though she already knew, already felt the answer deep in her soul. He closed his eyes, as if saying it would be the final wound. "You, through you." The mansion shuddered. Another crack, then another. As if something were breaking through to the surface, the air grew so cold that steam came from her mouth as she breathed. And then, for the first time since she had entered the house, the protagonist heard footsteps coming from the basement. Slow footsteps, heavy, hollow, as if someone were climbing an impossibly old staircase, step by step. Deliberate, inevitable. And as those footsteps rose, she understood with devastating clarity, none of this was a discovery, it was a return. A return that had begun the moment she stepped into the mansion. A return she was part of. A return she had, unknowingly, triggered. She looked one last time at the man on the floor. He was crying, not for himself, for her. And in the background the footsteps continued, climbing, calling her by a name that wasn't hers, but that, somehow, had always belonged to her. The footsteps kept rising from the depths of the basement like the beats of an ancient heart, resurrected by the force of a memory that never should have been summoned. The man on the floor struggled to breathe. His chest rose and fell unevenly, as though every motion cost more strength than he had left. The protagonist wanted to run to him, to hold him, to ask if there was still time, but the call inside her was too strong. An invisible thread held her in place, forcing every muscle to remain where it was. Fixing her attention on the staircase that led to the basement, the footsteps grew more distinct. Now she could hear not only the impact, but the faint drag of something, perhaps an old garment, perhaps the figure's own shadow. Each step seemed to arrive with a long echo, as if time itself was stretching around that being. Then the light flickered, and the whole house seemed to draw a deep breath. The protagonist felt her own heart and the heart of the mansion beat in unison, not to rhythms one, a single, deep, ritualistic pulse that seemed to announce not an ending, but a return. And then, the first part of the figure appeared at the top of the stairs. An outline, a human shape, but wrong, as if it were being rebuilt with each step, part solid, part shadow. The arms seemed to extend too far before settling into a proper length. The torso pulsed between density and emptiness, as if made of layers of existence. The head emerged tilted, as though it were still getting used to its own weight. But what truly made her recoil, even though her feet would not move, were the eyes. They had no iris, no color, no pupils, and yet, they saw deeply, they saw her. When the creature finished climbing, the room fell into an impossible kind of silence. Even the wind seemed to vanish. For the first time, the mansion was entirely attentive. Every inch of that place waited. The figure took its first step into the hallway, and spoke her name. Not the name her mother gave her, not the name she'd been called all her life. The old name, the name written in the book, the name that had echoed in the basement, the name she had never known existed. When she heard that sound, something inside her cracked, as if an inner fissure finally split open. The feeling was paradoxical, a mix of anguish and recognition, as if that name were not an intrusion, but a return to something that had once been hers, even if it had been forgotten. The man collapsed onto his side, exhausted, trying to lift his hand to stop her from answering, but his voice came out as a broken whisper, meaningless in the face of the force filling the room. The figure came closer, and the air around it warped like heat over asphalt, except it was cold, bone-deep cold. A cold that seeped into the bones, silenced thought, demanded surrender. And then, at last, she understood. The house didn't choose people. The house chose vessels, forms in which it could deposit the name, the original name, the lost name, the name of the vanished heir. He, the man who had walked beside her through the years, had never been the heir. He had only been a substitute, a bridge, a worn-out echo who carried the name while the true successor grew, lived, loved, walked the world without knowing that an ancestral house was watching from afar. He carried the name while she grew up with another family, while her destiny was carefully hidden, while the house waited for the moment when her presence would touch the ancestral ground. And when she finally crossed the threshold, the mansion woke. The figure stretched out one of its hands, a spectral, elongated hand that wavered between matter and smoke. When the gesture was complete, the floor shook again, harder this time, forcing the protagonist to brace herself against the table behind her. The voice spoke again. It wasn't just calling, it was summoning, commanding. It was the voice of the heir, of the original name, of what was left of him after he vanished, of what the mansion had preserved in fragments, echoes, memories, shadows. The man on the floor was crying now, tears falling silently onto the wood. He repeated no over and over again, as if denial could stop the ritual, but it couldn't. She took another step, this time, consciously. The moment she stepped into the hallway, the mansion vibrated like an organism receiving oxygen after years of suffocation. The chandelier above them swung violently, scattering crystals onto the floor. The windows flew open on their own, letting the fog pour in as thick torrents. The figure completed its gesture, and the bond was sealed. The protagonist felt everything as if a door inside her had swung open. Images shot through her mind, faces she didn't know, but that were familiar. The mansion and other times, alive, radiant, ancient voices reciting names, rituals, weeping, goodbyes, losses, a boy disappearing into the woods, a name erased, the same name given to another, and another, and another, until it reached her. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't coincidence, it was destiny. And then, for the first time, she heard the full story, not told in human words, but transmitted by the house itself, like a current flowing straight into her soul. The original heir had died in that house, in circumstances too dark to be forgotten. The mansion had gone mad with grief, as if it had a mind of its own. To keep it awake, alive, a new name was created, a replacement for the heir, a name that had to be carried by someone living, and that name could never be allowed to die. Not until the true substitute arrived. Not until the person who truly carried the blood, the memory, the bond was found. The figure took another step and touched her chest with two fingers made of shadow. The touch was cold but familiar, as if it were touching something that had always been hers. The man she loved shouted her name, the real, modern one, in one last plea, but she no longer belonged entirely to that name. The figure's touch ran through her chest like an inverted electric current, a shiver that began in her heart and spread through her veins, to her hands, her eyes, and then the voice spoke for the last time. It no longer called, it no longer commanded, it declared. The name returns to its origin. The protagonist felt her soul split, as if a deep layer of her own identity were tearing away and being pushed out. She staggered, clutching her chest, trying to hold herself together. But the ritual was older than she was, stronger than any human resistance. The lights flickered wildly, the walls shook, the floor seemed to open for a moment, and then everything went silent, completely, profoundly silent. The figure was gone. It evaporated like smoke, but something remained, something inside her. The mansion stopped trembling, the windows closed on their own, the air began to move again. The man on the floor was breathing with difficulty, fighting to lift his head. When he finally managed to look at her, his gaze was a devastating mix of pain, love, and irreversible loss, because he knew, he had seen. She now carried the name, not the way he had carried it, but as heir, as fulfilled destiny. The protagonist opened her eyes slowly, and something in them had changed, something deep, ancestral. An ancient brightness shone there, as if 1,000 lives overlapped in her gaze. She walked toward the man she loved. He tried to touch her, but his hand stopped in midair, as if there were an invisible barrier between them. She whispered something, not in her own voice, but in a doubled one, echoed, woven with the mansion's very air. "The promise is fulfilled," he cried. She did not, because in that moment, the mansion breathed in relief, and she breathed with the mansion. The ritual was complete. The name had returned to its place, and the house, at last, was at peace. The man stood up with difficulty, knowing he could no longer stay there. The house no longer recognized him. He walked to the door, each step heavy with pain, and, before crossing the threshold, he looked at her one last time, but she was no longer entirely herself. She was something else, something between human and memory, between woman and air, between flesh and promise. The door closed behind him, and the mansion turned off its lights, one by one, as if falling asleep for the first time in decades. In the main hall, the protagonist, now bearer of the name, sat in the old chair from which so many before her had once watched over the house, and she smiled, not with joy but with recognition, because she finally understood that some stories don't belong to the living or the dead. They belong to destiny. They belong to time. They belong to those who carry old names. And above all, they belong to the house.